Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your time together, speaking with one another during lunch and thinking about all we've talked about during this conference so far regarding the Claggett Statement. For this next period of time we have together, we have 3 speakers that we will be hearing from. First, we have Noah Buchholz.
And he will be discussing disability theology.
All right, sorry. Do you want me to back up? Sure. Okay. All right, let me back up. All right, first, we have 3 speakers. Noah Buchholz will be our first speaker, and then we'll have, he works at a program in Princeton University, and he'll be discussing how to analyze the theology of Noah connected with through the lens of the Claggett Statement. Secondly, we have a speaker, Minister
Kim Veney, who is an ASL interpreter and owner of Words and Sight Interpreting, an MDiv student at Howard Divinity School, will bring Black ASL into conversation with the Claggett Statement. And our last speaker for the panel this afternoon is William Stell, who is a faculty fellow at NYU. He will draw on crypt theory in conversation with the Claggett Statement. So that is the introduction to your panel for the afternoon. And it is my honor to welcome Noah to the stage. I would just like to take a moment to thank Audrey and Kirk for their welcome to have this opportunity to present to you. So first I want to show you, this is my sign name. And this is, oh, sorry, interpreter error. This is the sign for theology that I'll be using. Such an honor to be involved in this conference celebrating the 40th anniversary of Claggett. I've been involved for many years with deaf liberation theology. Been involved in deaf ministry for more than 20 years, and my work has always been guided by the ethics of liberation theology. In fact, it is Claggett that first introduced me to liberation theology when I was a teenager. Like with any other work, any other theological work, it is necessary to reinterpret Claggett through a lens of the current time. In this paper, I discuss how critical disability theory may help us effectively reinterpret Claggett. CDT emerges from critiques of traditional disability studies. We are indebted to TDS for the theorization of the social model and developing strategies for disability activism. However, TDS has been largely criticized for its neglect of diversity of disability, lack of intersectionality, and reliance on the liberal framework. It has also been criticized for focusing on white, middle class, disabled people's experiences, not accounting for various intersectional aspects of disability, including race, class, gender, and sexuality. CDT also stems from emerging critical theories based on Max Horkheimer's definition. Critical theory focuses on doing critical investigations, which are open-ended and self-critical investigations into the power dynamics of society, with the ultimate aims of explaining what is wrong with society and subsequently identifying practical agents for bringing about human emancipation from unjust sufferings. To use this definition, CDT is a methodology for doing a critical investigation in which disability is foregrounded. I do not state doing a critical investigation into disability, because this implies CDT is solely interested in examining disability in and of itself. To the contrary, CDT goes beyond disability in that it seeks to better understand the power dynamics of society in light of its examination of disability. As mentioned, one of the aims of critical theory is to identify practical agents for bringing about human emancipation. One of the most effective tools for doing so is strategic essentialism. Historically, people have uncritically and harmfully lumped people with various disabilities together as a single group of disabled people. However, the disabled community has exploited such essentialism to their advantage by building a powerful solidarity through the sweeping identity of disability. Nevertheless, many members of the deaf cultural community reject the disability label. This is indeed reflected in Claggett, which states, "We do not view deafness as a handicap. We view it as a gift from God, which has led to the creation of a unique language and culture, worthy of respect and affirmation." As a matter of fact, the notion that deaf people are not disabled did not become widespread until the 1980s when Claggett was developed. I believe this perspective stemmed from historical events affecting the deaf community at that time. In the 1960s, it was scientifically proven for the first time that sign language is a full-fledged language. This discovery, combined with the civil rights movement of the 1960s, empowered deaf people to take pride in their culture and language after enduring through a century of great suppression of sign language. However, deaf people faced a challenge. Many hearing people still did not believe that deaf people had their own culture or language. As a result, there was an urgent need to prove to the mainstream that they possessed a unique culture and language. Unfortunately, one approach taken to achieve this was distancing themselves from disability. They believed that disability and culture were mutually exclusive. Another reason was disabled people were badly stigmatized. Deaf people may have wanted to separate themselves from disabled people in order to reduce the stigma they experienced. However, what they should have done was to fight against the stigma rather than distance themselves from it, as distancing ultimately perpetuates the stigma against disabled people. Another result of this is the unfortunate divergence between deaf studies and disability studies. Fortunately, in recent years, more and more deaf people have started to embrace the label disability. We're also witnessing greater collaboration between deaf studies and disability studies than ever before. I believe this strengthens both fields since they have so much to offer each other. For these reasons, I urge the field of deaf theology to turn to disability studies and collaborate with other disabled communities in their discussing and expanding of the vision of liberation for deaf people as outlined in Claggett. Additionally, as we progress in deaf theology, we must address intersectionality, something that is missing in Claggett. As I mentioned, I first read Claggett when I was a teenager. It helped me see how liberation theology can be applied to deaf culture. However, after working with deaf people in other countries, I eventually realized that this is crucial to expand the vision of Claggett through intersectionality. I vividly remember one time when I was in Moldova, a group of us went to a deaf community gathering and passed out flyers for an upcoming event at a local deaf church. A group of deaf men walked towards us, and one of them, a tall, serious-looking man who seemed to be the leader of the pack, asked me, "Do you believe in God?" I replied, "Yes, do you?" He laughed and said, "It's easy for you Americans to say that God is real because you have everything, while down here we have nothing." Not knowing what to say, I stood in silence while they walked away. Later, I realized that while interacting with one of the most impoverished groups of people in the poorest European country, I failed to ask what Gustavo Gutierrez asks: how to proclaim the God of life to people who suffer premature and unjust death. This question absolutely cannot be addressed without taking into account intersectionality, since all forms of oppression are interlocked. In fact, the lack of intersectionality in Claggett reflects the widespread tendency of focusing on white, middle-class, disabled people's experiences in disability studies and disability theology. For example, in My Body is Not a Prayer Request, Amy Kennedy reimagines the sheep and goats passage in Matthew 25 in the context of disability justice. I picture Jesus telling the church who fought against the ADA, "Depart from me, for I was in a wheelchair and you gave me no ramp. I was deaf and you gave me no interpreter. I was blind and you gave me no visual descriptions. I needed an accessible bathroom and you did not install one because it was too expensive. I asked you not to insult me by saying lame and you laughed at me." I completely agree with the implication behind Kennedy's imaginative interpretation of the passage. However, it is unfortunate that Kennedy does not point out how the original passage applies to disabled people so thoroughly that it could be read as a manifesto for disability justice. For I was hungry, I was thirsty, I needed clothes. Based on worldwide statistics, disabled people may be considered as the poorest group of people in the world. I was a stranger. Numerous refugees, most of whom are people of color, have been, to use Jasbir Puar's word, debilitated by war. I was sick. Numerous disabled people are left sick to death. I was in prison. The majority of the incarcerated population in the United States, most of whom are people of color, are disabled. Kennedy's reimagination of the passage focuses on giving disabled people accommodations, neglecting other critical aspects of disability justice, including racial and socioeconomic justice. This indeed mirrors traditional disability studies, which has largely been criticized by CDT as focusing on middle class, white, disabled people's experiences. The liberation for disabled people must go beyond accessibility and inclusion. It must involve a transformation of the current system. It also goes the other way around. Any meaningful transformation of the current system is incomplete without disability justice. This aligns with one of the aims of CDT, to demonstrate disability is not merely a personal identity, but also a category of power used to justify oppression against other marginalized people. For example, CDT reveals that the current economic system draws on society's understanding of ability to justify economic oppression, which is also deeply racialized. For example, it claims that people are poor simply because they do not work hard enough. Additionally, the economic system emphasizes independence over interdependence, stigmatizing financial assistance. Examining disability as a category of power helps us not only to understand how disability is used to justify economic oppression, but also to resist against it. For example, the principles of disability justice, interdependence, equity, and the recognition of diverse abilities can help us develop a better economic system where everyone can thrive. However, as we address the lack of intersectionality in deaf theology in the future, we must not imitate the method of making superficial parallels between the oppression of disabled people and other forms of oppression commonly employed by traditional disability and deaf studies. For instance, in The Mask of Benevolence, Harlan Lane states, "I call deaf communities colonized because deaf communities have suffered oppression in all its forms and consequences, in common with other cultures that were literally subjugated by imperial powers." In order to support this statement, Lane draws parallels between the colonization of Africa and the oppression of deaf people. Deaf studies scholars are right to claim that deaf people are colonized in the sense that they are consummately oppressed by the overall ruling system of the world. That is, Western hegemony. They are also right to observe that many characteristics of the oppression of deaf people are similar to the characteristics of other forms of oppression. However, simply expanding the concept of colonialism and drawing parallels between the oppression of deaf people and other forms of oppression are not sufficient for locating the oppression of deaf people in what is called, quote, the colonial matrix of power, unquote, by Walter D. Mignolo, based on the theorization of Annabelle Quijano. Everything in this world, including the deaf community, is embedded in the colonial matrix of power. The network of power relations that is currently regulated by Western hegemony. As a result, in order to have a complete picture of the oppression of deaf people, one needs to understand its place in the colonial matrix of power. This can only be done by discovering the connections, i.e., how they are related to, influence, and rely on each other, rather than simply the parallels, i.e., how they are similar between the oppression of deaf people and other forms of oppression. Because everything in the colonial matrix of power is intertwined. Locating the oppression of deaf people in the matrix will ultimately empower deaf people to resist autism and ableism more effectively, and will make the map of the matrix an indispensable resistance tool for any oppressed group of people more complete. Even though Claggett lacks a discussion of intersectionality, we must acknowledge that Claggett was formed by a group of people with diverse identities, many of which were marginalized, including deaf, women, and queer. In fact, when Claggett was first proclaimed, it was rejected by many Christians, both deaf and hearing, solely because its authorship was comprised of certain identities, especially women and queer. Indeed, the proclamation of Claggett was courageous. As we advance in deaf theology, we should all emulate the pioneering and courageous spirit of Claggett. As the current scholarship in disability and deaf studies show, this ought to involve collaborating with other disabled communities and critically examining deaf experiences through a lens of intersectionality. By doing so, we can effectively expand the vision of liberation as boldly declared by Claggett. Thank you.
Now we have Minister Kim Veney.
It sounds good to me. I know I've been changed. Angels, heaven. Listen, somebody walked up to me and asked me a question one day. They said, girlfriend, how in the world can a brown cow eating green grass gonna turn around and give us some white milk? said, well, I don't know about that one. But one thing that I do know, that God's chemical laboratory of redemption took my black soul, stained with sin, and plunged me in red blood, the blood of Jesus. And I came out white as snow. Yes, I did. The angels in heaven done sign.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Praise God. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kirk, and thank you so much, Audrey, for this opportunity. I am honored to be among such scholars and pioneers. This research that I am doing engages the topic of Black American Sign Language, BASL, as praxis in worship and liturgy for both deaf and hearing sacred space communities. Not widely discussed publicly and without academic documentation, it is a topic worthy of community engagement and academic research. It is interdisciplinary approach involving studies in, but not limited to, spoken language, ASL, BASL, cultural anthropology, music, theopoetics, homiletics, hermeneutics, ableism, autism, worship, pneumatology, and womanist theology. And as an expansion, womanist theology is an extension of womanism, coined by Alice Walker, and then framed in liberation theology with foundations in James Cone and James Baldwin. The founders of them are Katie Geneva Cannon, Renita Weems, and other such notable scholars. The premise of this work is the growing phenomenon among hearing communities that meaning and spiritual affirmation can and are often derived from BASL, even when there are no community members who possess linguistic fluency. My goal here is to offer an expanded lens and open doors for deeper discussion of embodied worship among members within varying deaf communities and interpreting communities, including Black deaf, Black interpreter, faith leader, and hearing communities. Spanning over 25 years, my work can be seen in myriad spaces, including the 60th annual March on Washington, Senator Elizabeth Warren's speech on RBG's visual, sacred, theatrical, academic, and vulnerable spaces. As a womanist theologian, I approach this research from my varying hermeneutic intersections: Black, Afro-centered, hetero, single, mother, entrepreneur, and queer affirming. While interpreting, I often experience somatic responses, particularly with sacred music, corporate worship, or the preached word. And just to be clear, Maxwell, who is an R&B singer famous for his often sensuous lyrics, is sacred music too. So imagine that. Both BASL and African American English, or AAE, live in spaces of righteous indignation against white authority attempting to dictate what is and isn't proper grammar, sentence structure, and vernacular. BASL, like AAE, is coded language, and ways of expression are deeply rooted in opposition of white authority and remains, as AAE, in sacred space. The crossroads for Black deaf culture, Black hearing culture, and AAE provides this rarely discussed phenomenon that BASL in religious and performative settings can be understood and experienced as a source of inspiration and enlightenment for both hearing and deaf community members equally. Many deaf communities, however, have historically maintained that the function of interpreting should exist solely for the purpose of conveying information between spoken and sign language communities. They maintain that interpreting or signing intentionally without the presence of a deaf or hard of hearing person can be considered a bastardization of the language and minimizes the sacred nature of its belonging solely to the deaf community. This, according to many in the deaf community, can further autism. This research, however, asserts that the perspective of the language being bastardized diminishes the power, the ability, and the utter beauty of the language to transform and inspire persons who are not ASL linguistically fluent. Dismantling these ideologies of ASL and BASL is transformative in the understanding and approach to worship and liturgy in the Black church, and allows interpreters to share God with people in a way they may have never experienced. Open space for greater liturgical expression and invoke God and our ancestors in a manner that is more fully embodied. This research also offers an attempt for the Black, deaf, and hard of hearing communities to begin documenting, and I'll say that again, to begin documenting religion and spirituality within the Black deaf community. The efficacy of religion and spirituality in the lives of the Black deaf community, the roles of interpreters in sacred space, their understanding of faith traditions and sacred texts. While the majority of Black church worship is communally expressed through song, word, and dance, until now, however, BASL has never been viewed as an equal function, and this is an important missed opportunity for expanding ideas in worship and divine inspiration. This paper seeks to illuminate how BASL, steeped in African American culture, effectively functions as praxis in worship and liturgy for both hearing and deaf congregants. Though there is some separation between worship and liturgy, Lisa Allen, in her book, A Womanist Theology of Worship, suggests that Black worship and liturgy are communal. Comparatively, Catholic, evangelical, and predominantly white church experience are more individually contemplative, save for the greeting one another with the call and response, "Peace be with you," and also with you, correct. Most Black church experiences, however, posit a communal culture of call and response that is palpable, such as God is good, oh, and all the time. Amen. It also includes audible, visual declarations of agreement, embodied manifestations such as catching the Holy Ghost, dancing, clapping your hands, and other forms of spiritual awakening or indwelling that are all a part of the majority Black church experiences. Though scholarly literature in BASL and Black deaf communities exists, it is far from exhaustive, and much of the existing information is still oral narrative. In her story, Maxine Childress Brown, the sister of Shirley Childress, inaugural ASL interpreter for the musical group Sweet Honey in the Rock, shares her experience interpreting in the church for her parents and other deaf community members. Unlike other narratives, Maxine illustrates how her interpreting process differs in the church. The sway to the beat of the music, the facial expressions that give sight to the sound of the voices. There are certain postures an interpreter makes in the Black church spaces that do not exist in any other space. One of the cardinal rules of being an interpreter is to effectively match the linguistic tone and vernacular of the speaker. Not only is what an interpreter signs or says important, but half of the message resides in how it is said or signed. Often the greater ASL community views BASL as overly theatrical or too expressive. The expressiveness is, however, indicative of the very nature of African American English. The non-manual markers of AAE mirror non-manual markers of BASL. An eye roll, an eye cut, as described in Brown's book, is indicative of disdain, disgust, or dismissiveness. Non-manual markers and communication in the Black church follow suit. A raised hand, a stomp of the foot, seated or standing sway back and forth, communicate to the preacher and co-parishioner that they are in agreement or are feeling deeply from the music, word, or dance. Features in BASL function similarly. A hand, a non-manual marker create message conveying visually what hearing congregation is experiencing audibly. The role of the interpreter in these settings gets very blurred, as it is expected that the interpreter fully engage and embody the African American culture in their interpretation. If the interpreter, like other parishioners, is moved by the Spirit, their role is to provide visual linguistic not only in the preached word or song, but other responses audible in the sanctuary. Someone getting the Spirit or shouting praises, affirmation like preach, that's right, all must be communicated. In stark contrast, interpreting in majority white ASL communities typically requires absolute neutrality. Neutrality as an interpreter in the Black church, however, is the antithesis of a typical Black church experience. BASL interpreters, still functioning as conduits, also function as primary messengers. How an interpreter shows up in those sacred spaces can significantly alter the communal experience. BASL in sacred space requires the interpreter to not just interpret, but also fully culturally embody what is happening audibly. It is not an easy skill and strongly invites the interpreter to do the internal work as well as the professional skill building to effectively convey the Black church experience. Like a preacher in the space of a conduit to deliver God's message, so too does the interpreter function. In 2005, Blackman and Goodwin offered some context. Their research elucidates that skills necessary to navigate this space and boundaries present in secular interpreting spaces that must be eliminated in Black church settings. Their findings broach the topic of liturgy, but are framed as performative, which does not necessarily evoke the topic of worship or liturgy. Interpreting in the Black church is one of the most difficult things to interpret. It requires mastery in the use of space, role shift, memory recall, scriptural understanding, hermeneutics, predictive skills, and church etiquette. During the act of interpreting, all of these things are done simultaneously and at times maddening speed. May the Lord help you if the preacher is long-winded. In her 2015 thesis, Schomburger alludes to this proclivity in more depth. Good God, our hands. Distilling the lived experiences of African Americans in predominantly white interpreting field, Dr. Ford offers frameworks of understanding through hermeneutic phenomenology lenses. She offers varied and common lived experiences of African American interpreters as evidenced by profession, education, and peer relationships. Many African American interpreters, though, have received formal education and accreditation, began their careers as faith-based interpreters, which supports the theory of BASL as worship and liturgy. Comparatively, Friedner, in a rare article, discusses the proclivities of ASL interpreting in Christian-based communities. Though the researcher interviewed 9 African American women who interpret in churches, none, including the researcher, offered Black church experience or BASL as a factor in interpreting. These 3 articles mentioned represent the bulk of the academically sound documentation of ASL and BASL in the Black church, and that is very unfortunate. Continued research, heavily laden with primary resources from the deaf community members, faith leaders, and hearing community members, is crucial to this work, and it has already been noted that none such exists. My hope is that this paper and this research sparks deeper conversations among the aforementioned communities and in the academy to push forward the idea of Black ASL as a form of worship and liturgy. Ashe.
Now our last presenter for the session, William Stell, faculty fellow at NYU. Take it away, William. Okay, we good? Okay, here we go. Nearly 20 years ago, Robert McRuer wrote a book called Crip Theory, which argues that disability studies and queer studies have a lot of similarities, a lot of overlap. For example, both areas of study focus on ideas about the normal ideas about how society determines some bodies to be normal and other bodies not. And both areas of study aim to resist those ideas. McRuer hopes that disability studies and queer studies will shape each other, not in order to equate them or judge between them, but in order to better understand disability, queerness, and social power more broadly. And who are our guides here? Queer disabled people, their experiences, and their activist work. The same point is true for theology. Disability theology and queer theology have a lot of similarities and overlap. Now, I'm not really a theologian, I'm a historian. However, I still notice that both disability theology and gay theology, before queer theology, were beginning to develop at the same time during the 1980s. In addition, the theology of the Claggett Statement and queer theology are teaching similar principles. Both are theologies of liberation, of course, but we can say more. Let's look at the first two sentences of the Claggett Statement. We believe God created the world and saw that it was good. God created women and men to live with dignity and self-respect as children of God. So the Claggett Statement in English uses the word dignity. But the Claggett Statement in ASL uses this sign, which can mean pride. And queer people use that same sign for LGBTQ pride. Interesting overlap. Anyways, a lot of queer theology begins with the same principles that we see here in Claggett, emphasizing the goodness of all creation, including our bodies are good, and emphasizing the need for pride. Why emphasize pride? Because both deaf people and queer people have histories of oppression based on ideas that their bodies and their actions are wrong, are sick, are sinful. Now, for this presentation, I want to focus on deaf queer religious community before Claggett. Yes, there were churches that were serving deaf queer Christians a long time before Claggett, beginning in 1970. However, these churches did not follow the principles of Claggett. They tended to be paternalistic and patronizing, and they did not recognize the unique perspectives and unique gifts of deaf people. The church is named the Metropolitan Community Church, MCC. The church was founded in 1968 in Los Angeles, becoming the largest LGBTQ organization in the US. Not just the largest church, largest organization during the 1970s. During the 1970s, the MCC grew rapidly all over the US. The MCC's deaf ministry began in 1969 in Los Angeles, when deaf queer people visited the church then. More and more deaf people started going, and some became members. Sometimes a deaf person performs an ASL during worship. More often, however, the congregation signs one song, the same song again and again, and sometimes the choir sings and signs at the same time. Now that's nice enough, but it's not the Claggett Statement's vision. The Claggett Statement asserts that we need to stop trying to communicate the gospel through hearing people's ways, and deaf people need to create forms of worship that are indigenous to the deaf community. And merely adding sign to songs in English is not that. It's pushing deaf people into hearing forms of worship. Now, during the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of MCC churches all over the US have deaf members and have interpreters, and the MCC's national conference always had ASL interpretation. In addition, there's a very interesting story about ASL at the MCC's conference in 1972. All the people were gathered for prayer, and someone suddenly began speaking in tongues for the first time during an MCC conference. Another person began interpreting the spoken message in English, but later people said that the ASL interpreter was signing the message before the spoken message was interpreted. So the message from the Holy Spirit came first in sign, then in English. It's a fascinating story. Now, I wish that this experience would have led the MCC to recognize that deaf people have unique gifts that their churches needed, like the Claggett Statement affirms. But in general, the MCC did not recognize this. Instead, the MCC was more paternalistic and patronizing. For evidence, let's look at the MCC's newsletter, an article titled, "Will Someone Sign for Me?" This is the only article in the MCC's newsletter that is focused on the MCC's deaf ministries during the 1970s and 1980s. The article emphasizes Jesus' words in Matthew 25, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do the same for me." Again and again, the article describes the deaf as the least of these. And why are they the least? It seems because they can't hear. And so they need hearing people's help. Now, for a few sentences, the article gives a different message, describing deaf people and queer people both as outcasts, meaning that society oppresses them both, and saying that queer hearing people cannot turn our backs on other outcasts, meaning deaf. So it's a message on solidarity, which is great, but again and again, the article preaches the idea of deaf people as least. And in doing so, it overlooks the unique gifts of deaf people. And what are these unique gifts? I will give just one example using my own experience. A long time ago, I learned that sign language has a unique ability to help people believe that their bodies are good. When I was a student at a Christian college, I acquired all of the knowledge I needed to come out as gay. I studied the Bible and theology. I learned about gender and sexuality in classes, read a lot of scholarship. And when I graduated, I concluded that people can be gay and Christian, no problem. But because of my religious upbringing, it was very hard for me to accept my own gay desires. Hard to accept that my body was truly good. Other queer people were fine. But me, my body, that was hard to accept. Then, after college, I lived in a deaf community for 1 year in the country of Jordan. During that year, I signed more than I spoke. Every day, I wasn't really using my mouth. Instead, I was using all of my body in signing. Because I needed all of my body to participate in this community. Of course, hearing people also rely on their whole bodies to communicate, but it's easy for them to forget it. If you use sign language, you can't forget it. You always remember that you need all of your body. Over time, this deaf community in Jordan became my home. And using sign language every day gave me a new way to understand my body, to accept my body, to love my body. And when I left that community and came back to the United States, I was ready for the first time to come out. I think this is one of the most beautiful gifts that deaf culture can give to queer people and other people in churches and outside of churches. To help us to know, really know, that our bodies are good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Wonderful panel here. So we're thinking about how to integrate all these things, all these diverse things together into one place. So we're providing one place where we can think about this liberation theology, and intersectionality. So we'd like you all to interact with each other, and we have question and answers now. I have a question. I want to speak English. Does anyone have a microphone for me? I really practiced that presentation over and over again so I could sign it, but I don't really sign well. Is this on? Hello.
Testing, testing. There we go. Okay, thank you. Kim, I want to ask you to reflect on, I noticed, correct me if I didn't notice correctly, but when you were signing during the song, right, a very common refrain in Black church spaces, I know that I know that I know that I know. What I think I saw you sign was, I know that I know that I know. And it struck me as so beautiful, in part because I am thinking a lot about deafness and not deaf people and their bodies, right? And what deaf people can teach non-deaf people, hearing people, and everyone, what they can teach everyone about bodies. And so this is a knowing, right? Like I would love to hear you talk about that. And I'll add to that real quick. I mentioned in my presentation, right? A long time ago, my Jordanian Sign Language was better than my American Sign Language. And I remember when I was learning Jordanian Sign Language, being so struck that the sign for to learn, right, was not this, right, coming up, but was this. And what it meant, and maybe that's BSL, I don't know. But that I was, where am I learning from is this larger question that I think deaf people can answer more robustly and more truthfully than a lot of hearing people do. And watching you sign, right? Showing me, how do I know? Where do I know? Showing that you know that you know that you know that you know in different places. This is not really a question. This is just an invitation to say more if you want.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Actually, I'm going to sign.
Oh, yes. Typically, when I'm signing, if there's a word that's repeated again and again, I will change the sign. And so when you say no, it's kind of a surface way of understanding that concept is to refer to your head, but you can also talk about knowing in your body, so to speak, and your gut senses of knowing, your way of knowing, your soul, your spiritual kind of knowing, your soul knowing. I know from the depths of my soul. Different ways to sign. So we're changing our sign to emphasize, to make the emphasis in the word more apparent as it's sung. So I noticed when you were signing the song. Oh, hold on. They can't see you. Okay. Can they see me now? Okay. I noticed when you were signing, there was one time when you're keeping beat with your foot. And you're using your entire body, and see how there was a entire body expression going on when you were signing, which is more of a BSL approach. BASL.
I'd like to also follow up on some of the questions that you raised about it, what it really means to interpret. What is linguistic analysis at the meaning level? And what I saw you do is trying to actually, as best you were able, put in physical form with signs and your body what you experience or how you interpret the actual meaning of the English users. And that's a phenomenal thing that's kind of stretching the boundaries of what the interpreting field has been working with. We've always talked about, I say we, I'm not really an interpreter, but we've always talked about semantic analysis needing to try for an equivalent in the target language. So if you were speaking English, the target language is ASL. And what's the equivalent experience of the users who are hearing English? What are they getting? And that requires then trying to give an equivalent in the target language, which means, of course, it has to be fitting with the culture of the community in that context. It's very, very complex, very, very difficult. I hope that's what we all strive for. And so when you described what I thought you were saying, if I may have misunderstood you, I thought you were saying in the white hearing and context, that was not the expectation. And that was where I felt personally, I hope that the white hearing context actually tries to do the same thing, because then you have meaning equivalence.
Okay, so good question. And it's the space of neutrality that I was discussing. So it's, you always must work for the equivalent. So whether it's a white space or a Hispanic space or whatever, you have to match that. So it was the neutrality that I'm challenging. So in most white spaces that I'm interpreting, there is a level of neutrality that does not happen in the Black church. So in the Black church, I'm expected to remove part of that neutrality because I am a part of the community. And so the African-American community suggests we're all in this. There's really there's really not a lot of separation between you and I. We're all in this. So that line of neutrality kind of gets really blurred. So it wasn't necessarily what you're posing as not working for equivalence in any space. It's just that line of not adjust. It's that line of neutrality that gets blurred in the Black deaf church that does not get blurred in most white spaces. I hope that answers it.
So the whole concept of neutrality, which has been a sort of sacred cow in the hearing community of interpreters, I think that needs relooking at too. I don't actually believe it's true.
Anyone else got questions? Okay. You have a question? Yes. Would someone voice for me? Okay. Yes. So you were discussing two things. One, you were saying before the 1970s, that there was a difference in the culture. You were discussing about the difference in the culture before and after the 1970s? Yeah. So it's more complicated than you had made it out in relation to AIDS. There were cochlear implants. There were so many more things. There was a double tax.
So to consider those who are deaf and blind, they considered a double tax. So blind people, unfortunately, kind of had to accept that, but deaf people rejected that idea. So the blind went ahead and paid the double tax. The deaf community did not. And there was kind of are you aware of that kind of controversy? And can you talk about that?
It was a complicated process. You know, there are people assigning But if you look at the written words, it seems it's not clear. From the 1980s, there were more.
There's more deaf scholarship then that started in the 80s. And there was a concept that maybe the disability community and the deaf community didn't really coincide, but they do in some respects. So in the early 20th century, there was the discussion, that argument between disability law rights, deaf rights. Susan Bush was an author. The thesis of the signs of resistance, and excluded kind of the notion of disability. But if you look at it more closely, the argument that is posed is limited. It talks about, it discusses rights, but the ability to work and earn income, employment. So, but the work opportunities are more limited for those in the deaf community. So whoever who was involved with those discussion, it was a very limited group of deaf people that were involved. And it was really just a scrap of discussion. But there are authors and all scholarship out there of that poses that disability and deafness and deaf culture can coincide. So the argument is taking it into various contexts, but it hasn't always been discussed about merging the two ideas. There are some, I mean, that's why I'm saying it's much more complicated than it appears on the surface. But I do think after the 1980s, there was a clear distinction at that time. There was a turning point where the deaf community indicated we are not disabled. We are not part of the disability community more before that.
So related to that, the deaf identity, how would we describe this? So Patty Ladd, that concept of deafhood. There were three authors. I don't remember. So with social media, traditional mom, traditional model of disability.
Yeah, then it formed the social model of disability. And I think that is being continued to be developed. Yes. So this is Ella. Before that time, before Patty's written work on deafhood, society didn't really have a construct of disability. There were still a lot of barriers because the emphasis started to become on access. My interpretation is that there was one culture, one language, and the disability community was trying to be a part of that one culture, one language. Of course, speaking English, American culture, American language, spoken English. We don't have a ramp for mobility access. We need to put that in there. We need to have access for those who are blind to use Braille, etc. So the deaf community, has different ways of access, of course, interpreting, captioning, etc. And I'm curious on your perspective, but my perspective is that. So the third thing I wanted to mention is the third model, the cultural model, which more closely aligns and more partners, I would say, with the minority of other cultures. Other minority cultures we share, and it is more appropriate for the deaf community, because that's where we more closely align as a cultural minority. So do you have a perspective on that? I do. I'll try to make it short. There are many criticisms on the liberal framework. The popular in the late popular framework in the late 19th century. And yes, disability groups did try to, as you mentioned, draw parallels in that model with the minority groups' experiences and minority culture. The problem is, as I mentioned, that they didn't really discuss the differences in oppression. You say, well, Black people have experienced oppression just like us. So if they have the civil rights law, then you should give us the civil rights law too, just like Black people. But they didn't really take a look at how the Black experience and the deaf experience are different. And if you can identify how their differences are, then you can also see how they are connected, and then use both when we look at a variety of groups that are at the hands of oppression and experience oppression. So the dialogue with disability lessens some of that cultural minority, but I'm just fascinated by that distinction of like the similarity between other cultural minorities, achieving cultural recognition, fighting for rights, etc. And we are drawn to that. And that is very attractive. I agree. But I feel like it's not critical. It's not necessarily critical enough because it causes problems to really examine. It's much more complex than it appears on the surface. So between the deaf community experience and other linguistic or cultural minorities experiences. So the social model and the linguistic cultural model, I think the multicultural framework is weak in and of itself. I think it has to go above and beyond the multicultural framework. And of course, I'm trying to do this in summary. And as I said, the social framework and the cultural framework, I think, can work together. I think that's actually more critical than just picking one framework and following it exclusively.
I think that this has been a great conversation. I think it'll continue as we go on. We'll love to see this conversation continue and expand. To think more about in different ways how we can explore this. And how we can change our view of deaf identity. Dr. Annalise Culture and Michelle Flanders. The two of them they look at deaf sociology not as a model, but but where deaf identity is created, that space, and maintained. That's where it resides. That's where the deaf identity resides. To really think about what it means, the framework to be as a deaf person, that identity as a deaf person. It shifts disability studies really equate equality with the disability culture. Disability culturally centered, that's the identity that the community is formed as a culture of disability. We've talked about cultural identity, but limited to physical disability. What are your thoughts related to those things?
So the concept of deaf sociology and deafhood shifting from simply a cultural identity to the new ideas of the space of which identity is discovered and transformed. So disability as a cultural expression and how that develops, how that grows. So throwing that into the mix. I should have simplified the question there at the onset. To simply answer your question, I think what's important is to separate deaf studies. So if we need to talk about what it is trying to tell us about identity and how the community labels themselves. And at the same time, what is best ethical practice for the community? How we should develop our own community and to socialize with the world as a result. Personally, I don't agree that we should dismiss the concept of disability, but I think it's important to listen and to hear that deaf people's perspective that we are not disabled. But what are they trying to tell us through that rejection of the disability label? That they're trying to say is, yes, we have a unique cultural and identity that the larger community doesn't always recognize. And like Ella brought up, for the deaf community, they want to be involved in public space. But we also want to have our own space. It's a both and. And I think that's what it's telling us in terms of the concept of rejecting disability as a label, but at the same time, we have to think about what is best ethical practice as a community. And that will help shape us how we move forward in terms of disability studies, making a difference, distinguishing that two parts of the framework. And it's interesting, I noticed a disability study with Crip time and Crip space as we're talking about it. And you start to see a shift within disability studies, reimagining the space from a Crip point of view. And do you have anything to add from the Crip studies perspective? I don't mean to put you on the spot, William, so. We have maybe time for one more question. Two more questions, I guess. Over here first. Oh, sorry. To the other side of the room first. I'm curious from the three of you, what would you like to tell the church, the deaf church? What would you want to share with them about what you'd like to see from them? as a deaf person that's involved in the church, how do I go forward with my identity as a deaf person in worship and believing in God? Do you have ideas? What advice would you share with the deaf church, with the lay deaf church?
So I'll start with a kudos and a congratulations and a thank God and we need more. Howard University School of Divinity now has its first deaf student. I am proud. I have cried. And it is an uphill battle to make sure that she gets the interpreters that she needs to be successful. So in that vein, what I would say to the deaf church, to congregants who go to hearing spaces, if there is not a seat at the table, I'm going to use a quote from the 60s from his last name is Foreman, and I will not use the curse word. If there is not a seat at the table, break the legs off. It is time, because all of your perspectives and your voices must be heard. And it is time. If there is no space at the table for you, break the legs down and be forceful about it. The church serves, but we serve as a community, and we need everybody involved to serve. So not just making sure that there are interpreters for services, making sure that the deaf community is at the table that makes decisions for the community.
I don't feel comfortable in general as a hearing person being like, well, here's advice I have for, the deaf churches or for deaf people in general. What I will say are two things. One, thank you, right? Like, I mean, the fact is the deaf community, right, has already given me, right, a precious gift, an incalculable gift that I'm grateful for every day. So I say thank you. And then two, I would say that I would hope that deaf churches and all churches wouldn't make the same mistakes that I was describing the MCC making, this largely queer church making, when it comes to deaf people. What is that mistake? That mistake is not recognizing that certain people in your midst have unique perspectives and have unique gifts to offer their churches. And so I would say to deaf churches and hearing churches alike that queer people are those people who have unique perspectives, unique gifts, and it's not just a matter of bringing them into the table because that's what's just, that's what's right, although that's true. It's also a matter of bringing them into the table because you need them. And your church, your churchly practices, ideas, ways of living, ways of thinking need queer people, queer perspectives.
Hi, I wanted to both do two things. One, thank this panel. This was amazing. So I appreciated each of your papers so very much. And two, I want to wade in a little bit as a historian, just to add a bit of context, because that's kind of like a job description and weakness, about the ongoing debates between deaf studies and disability studies, and talk a bit about how far back those go and how maybe more foundational they are to where we are right now in 21st century discourse than you may be aware of. Because I remember in 2000 in the summer being at a disability studies seminar sponsored in San Francisco, where I met Ella. And she doesn't remember because I'm a nobody and she is a legend. But she came out to San Francisco for that event. And we, as participants, as scholars, were arguing most of that summer about the relationship between disability studies and deaf studies, and that was the summer of 2000. Robert McCruer, who you mentioned, his book about crypt theory hadn't come out yet. He was working on that, and those ideas, they were percolating in that summer of 2000, after we spent most of the summer tearing each other apart. And his book came out in 2006. So I think those conversations that we started were fruitful. And I think that because I just saw this panel. And I think it's an indication of still having work to do to bring those two together and to honor each other and their similarities and their differences. But this current work you are all doing gives me hope that good things are happening. So I thank you for that.
And that is the name of this conference, Signs of Hope. So perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, panel. I really appreciate just your amazing work. So let's give them a sign of our appreciation. We will have a break now, and we'll resume at 3:30 for the next panel. Thank you so much.